A baritone is a type of classical male singing voice whose vocal range lies between the bass and the tenor voice types. It is the most common male voice. Originally from the Greek beta alpha rho upsilon tau omicron nu omicron sigma, meaning deep sounding. Music for this voice is typically written in the range from the second F below middle C to the F above middle C in choral music, and from the second A below middle C to the A above middle C in operatic music, but can be extended at either end. The baritone voice type is generally divided into the baryton-Martin baritone, lyric baritone, Kavalierbariton, Verdi baritone, dramatic baritone, baryton-noble baritone, and a bass-baritone. History. The first use of the term baritone emerged as baritonins late in the 15th century, usually in French sacred polyphonic music. At this early stage it was frequently used as the lowest of the voices, but in 17th century Italy the term was all-encompassing and used to describe the average male choral voice. Baritones took roughly the range we know today at the beginning of the 18th century, but they were still lumped in with the bass colleagues until well into the 19th century. Indeed, many operatic works of the 18th century have roles marked as bass that in reality are low baritone roles. Examples of this are to be found, for instance, in the operas and oratorios of George Friedrich Handel. The greatest and most enduring parts for baritones in 18th century operatic music were composed by Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart. They include Count Almaviva in The Marriage of Figaro, Guglielmo in Così fan tutte, Papageno in The Magic Flute, and the lead in Don Giovanni. 19th century. We see in theatrical documents, cast lists, and journalistic dispatches that from the beginning of the 19th century till the mid-1820s, the terms primo basso, basse chantant, and bassati were often used for men who would later be called baritones. These included the likes of Filippo Galli, Giovanni Incindi, and Henry Bernard de Bardi. The bassati and the proper bass were commonly confused because the roles were sometimes sung by singers of either actual voice part. The bel canto style of vocalism which arose in Italy in the early 19th century supplanted the castrato-dominated opera seria of the previous century. It led to the baritone being viewed as a separate voice category from the bass. Traditionally, basses in operas had been cast as authority figures such as a king or high priest, but with the advent of the more fluid baritone voice, the roles allotted by composers to lower male voices expanded in the direction of trusted companions or even romantic leads, normally the province of tenors. More often than not, however, baritones found themselves portraying villains. The principal composers of bel canto opera are considered to be Gioacchino Rossini, Gaetano Donizetti, Vincenzo Bellini, Giacomo Meyerbeer, and the young Giuseppe Verdi. The prolific operas of these composers, plus the works of Verdi's maturity, such as Un ballo in Mastra, La Forza del Destino, Don Carlo, the revised Simon Boccanegra, Aida, Otello and Falstaff, blazed many new and rewarding performance pathways for baritones. Figaro in Il Barbiere is often called the first true baritone role. However, Donizetti and Verdi in the vocal writing went on to emphasize the top fifth of the baritone voice, rather than its lower notes, thus generating a more brilliant sound. Further pathways opened up when the musically complex and physically demanding operas of Richard Wagner began to enter the mainstream repertoire of the world's opera houses during the second half of the 19th century. The major international baritone of the first half of the 19th century was the Italian Antonio Tamburini. He was a famous Don Giovanni in Mozart's eponymous opera, as well as being a Bellini and Donizetti specialist. Commentators praised his voice for its beauty, flexibility, and smooth tonal emission, which are the hallmarks of a bel canto singer. Tamburini's range, however, was probably closer to that of a bass baritone than to that of a modern Verdi baritone. His French equivalent was Henry Bernard de Badi, who was a mainstay of the Paris opera between 1819 and 1836 and the creator of several major Rossinian baritone roles, including Guillaume Tell. De Badi sang in Italy, too, where he originated the role of Belcourt in L'Elysée d'Amour in 1832. The most important of Tamburini's Italianate successes were all Verdians. They included Giorgio Ronconi, who created the title role in Verdi's Nabucco; Felice Varesi, who created the title roles in Macbeth and Rigoletto as well as Germont in La Traviata; Antonio Superchi, the originator of Don Carlo in Ernani; Francesco Graziani, who was the original Don Carlo di Vargas in La Forza del Destino; Leone Giraldoni, the creator of Renato in Un ballo in Mastra and the first Simon Boccanegra; Enrico del Sadi, who was London's first Renato; Adriano Pantaleoni, renowned for his performances as Amorsaro in Aida as well as other Verdi roles at La Scala, Milan; Francesco Pandolfini, whose singing at La Scala during the 1870s was praised by Verdi; Antonio Cotoni, a much-lauded singer in Milan, London and St. Petersburg, the first Italian poser in Don Carlos and later a great vocal pedagogue; 2. Filippo Colletti, creator of Verdi's Gusmano in Alzira, Francesco in I Masnadieri, Germont in the second version of La Traviata and for whom Verdi considered writing the opera Lear; Giuseppe del Puente, who sang Verdi to acclaim in the United States. Among the non-Italian-born baritones that were active in the third quarter of the 19th century, Tamburini's mantle as an outstanding exponent of Mozart and Donizetti's music was probably taken up most faithfully by a Belgian, Camille Everardi, who later settled in Russia and taught voice. In France, Paul Baroilhet succeeded de Badi as the Paris Opera's best-known baritone. Like de Badi, he also sang in Italy and created an important Donizetti role, in his case, Alphonse in La Favorite. Luckily, the gramophone was invented early enough to capture on disc the voices of the top Italian Verdi and Donizetti baritones of the last 2 decades of the 19th century, whose operatic performances were characterized by considerable recreative freedom and a high degree of technical finish. They included Mattia Battistini, Giuseppe Cashman, who atypically sang Wagner's Tell Ramin and Amphitas not in Italian but in German. At the Bayreuth Festival in the 1890s, Giuseppe Campanari, Antonio Magini Colletti, Mario Ancona, and Antonio Scotti, who came to the Met from Europe in 1899 and remained on the roster of singers until 1933. Antonio Pinicorsi was the standout Italian buffo baritone in the period between about 1880 and World War I, reveling in comic opera roles by Rossini, Donizetti and Pier, among others. In 1893, he created the part of Ford in Verdi's last opera, Falstaff. Notable among the contemporaries were the cultured and technically adroit French baritones Jean Lassalle, Victor Morel, Paul Lheacutaie, and Maurice Renaud. Lassalle, Morel and Renaud enjoyed superlative careers on either side of the Atlantic and left a valuable legacy of recordings. 5 other significant francophone baritones who recorded too During the early days of the gramophone, phonograph were Elia Couto and Melchizedek and Gianotti of the Paris Opera and Gabriel Sola-Croix, Henry Albers and Charles Gillibert of the Opéra Comique. The Quaker baritone David Bispham, who sang in London and New York between 1891 and 1903, was the leading American male singer of this generation. He also recorded for the gramophone. The oldest born star baritone known for sure to have made solo gramophone discs was the Englishman Sir Charles Santi. Santi made his operatic debut in Italy in 1858 and became one of Covent Garden's leading singers. He was still giving critically acclaimed concerts in London in the 1890s. The composer of Faust, Charles Gounod, wrote Valentine's aria, Even Bravest Heart, for him at his request for the London production in 1864 so that the leading baritone would have an aria. A couple of primitive cylinder recordings dating from about 1900 have been attributed by collectors to the dominant French baritone of the 1860s and 1870s. Jean-Baptiste Fauré, the creator of Poser in Verdi's original French-language version of Don Carlos. It is doubtful, however, that Fauré made the cylinders. However, a contemporary of Faurè's, Antonio Cotoni, probably the foremost Italian baritone of his generation, can be heard briefly and dimly at the age of 77 on a duet recording with the tenor Francesco Marconi. There are 19th-century references in the musical literature to certain baritone subtypes. These include the light and tenorish baryton-Martin, named after French singer Jean-Blaise Martin, and the deeper, more powerful Heldenbariton of Wagnerian opera. Perhaps the most accomplished Heldenbaritons of Wagner's day were August Kindermann, Franz Betz and Theodor Reichmann. Betz created Hans Sachs in Die Meistersinger and undertook Wotan in the first Der Ring des Nibelungen cycle at Bayreuth, while Reichmann created Amphitheaters in Parsifal, also at Bayreuth. Lyric German baritones sang lighter Wagnerian roles such as Wolfram in Tannhäuser, Kirwanal in Tristan und Isolde et El Ramond in Lohengrin. They made large strides too in the performance of art song and oratorio, with Franz Schubert favoring several baritones for his vocal music, in particular Johann Michael Vogel. 19th-century operettas became the preserve of lightweight baritone voices. They were given comic parts in the tradition of the previous century's comic bass by Gilbert and Sullivan in many of the productions. This did not prevent the French master of operetta, Jacques Offenbach, from assigning the villain's role in the Tales of Hoffmann to a big-voiced baritone for the sake of dramatic effect. Other 19th-century French composers like Meyerbeer, Hector Berlioz, Camille Saint-Saëns, Georges Bizet and Jules Massenet wrote attractive parts for baritones, too. These included Nalusco in L'Africaine, Mephistopheles in La Damnation de Faust, the priest of Dagon in Samson and Delilah, Escamillo in Carmen, Zerga in Les Peccas de Perles, Lescaut in Manon, Nathaniel in Thais and Herod in Erodiad. Russian composers included substantial baritone parts in their operas. Witness the title roles in Peter Tchaikovsky's Eugene Onegin and Alexander Borodin's Prince Igor. Mozart continued to be sung throughout the 19th century, although, generally speaking, his operas were not revered to the same extent that they are today by music critics and audiences. Back then, baritones rather than high basses normally sang Don Giovanni, arguably Mozart's greatest male operatic creation. Famous dons of the late 19th and early 20th centuries included Scotti and Morel, as well as Portugal's Francisco de Andrade and Sweden's John Forsell. 20th century. The dawn of the 20th century opened up more opportunities for baritones than ever before, as a taste for strenuously exciting vocalism and lurid, slice-of-life, operatic plots took hold in Italy and spread elsewhere. The most prominent verismo baritones included such major singers in Europe and America as the Polish Giuseppe De Luca, Mario Sammarco, Eugenio Giraldoni, Pasquale Amato, Riccardo Stracciari and Domenico Viglione Borghese, whose voice was exceeded in size only by that of the lion-voiced Tito Ruffo. Ruffo was the most commanding Italian baritone of his era, or arguably any other era. He was at his prime from the early 1900s to the early 1920s and enjoyed success in Italy, England and America. Between them, these baritones established the act performance style for baritones undertaking roles in verismo operas. The chief verismo composers were Giacomo Puccini, Ruggero Leoncavallo, Pietro Mascagni, Alberto Franchetti, Umberto Giordano and Francesco Solia. Verdi's works continued to remain popular, however, with audiences in Italy, the Spanish-speaking countries, the United States and the United Kingdom, and, interestingly enough, Germany, where there was a major Verdi revival in Berlin between the wars. Outside the field of Italian opera, an important addition to the Austro-German repertory occurred in 1905. This was the premiere of Richard Strauss's Salome, with the pivotal part of John the Baptist assigned to a baritone. Then, in 1925, Germany's Leo Schützendorf created the title baritone role in Alban Berg's harrowing Wozzeck. In a separate development, the French composer Claude Debussy's post-Wagnerian masterpiece Pelléas et Mélisande featured not one but two lead baritones at its 1902 premiere. These two baritones, Jean Perrier and Hector de France, possessed contrasting voices. Characteristic of the Wagnerian baritones of the 20th century was a general progression of individual singers from higher-lying baritone parts to lower-pitched ones. This was the case with Germany's Hans Hotter. Hotter made his debut in 1929. As a young singer he appeared in Verdi and created the commandant in Richard Strauss's Friedenstag and Olivier in Capriccio. By the 1950s, however, he was being hailed as the top Wagnerian bass baritone in the world. His Wotan was especially praised by critics for its musicianship. Other major Wagnerian baritones have included Hochter's predecessors Leopold Demuth, Anton van Rooy, Hermann Weyl, Clarence Whitehall, Friedrich Shaw, Rudolf Bockelmann and Hans Hermann Nissen. Demuth, van Rooy, Weyl and Whitehall were at the peak in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, while Shaw, Bockelmann and Nissen were stars of the 1920s and 1930s. In addition to the heavyweight Wagnerian cousins, there was a plethora of baritones with more lyrical voices active in Germany and Austria during the period between the outbreak of WW1 in 1914 and the end of WW2 in 1945. Among them were Joseph Schwartz, Heinrich Schlussness, Herbert Janssen, Willy Domgraf Fassbinder, Carl Schmidt Walter and Gerhard Husch. Their abundant interwar Italian counterparts included, among others, Carlo Galeffi, Giuseppe Danise, Enrico Molinari, Umberto Urbanumber, Cesare Formici, Luigi Montesanto, Apollo Granforte, Benvenuto Franchi, Renato Zanelli, Mario Basiala, Giovanni Inchileri, Carlo Morelli and Carlo Tagliabue, who retired as late as 1958. One of the best-known Italian Verdi baritones of the 1920s and 1930s, Mariano Stabile, sang Iago and Rigoletto and Falstaff under the baton of Arturo Toscanini. Stable also appeared in London, Chicago and Salzburg. He was noted more for his histrionic skills than for his voice. However, Stable was followed by Tito Gobby, a versatile singing actor capable of vivid comic and tragic performances during the years of his prime in the 1940s, 1950s and early 1960s. He learned more than 100 roles in his lifetime and was mostly known for his roles in Verdi and Puccini operas, including appearances as Scarpia opposite soprano Maria Callas's Tosca at Covent Garden. Gobby's competitors included Gino Ricci, Giuseppe Valdengard, Paolo Silveri, Giuseppe Taddei, Ettore Bastianini, Cesare Bardelli and Giangiacomo Guelfi. Another of Gobby's contemporaries was the Welshman Geraint Evans, who famously sang Falstaff at Glyndebourne and created the roles of Mr. Flint and Mountjoy in works by Benjamin Britten. Some considered his best role to have been Wozzeck. The next significant Welsh baritone was Bryn Terfel. He made his premiere at Glyndebourne in 1990 and went on to build an international career as Falstaff and, more generally, in the operas of Mozart and Wagner. The first famous American baritone appeared in the 1900s. It was the American-born but Paris-based Charles W. Clarke, who sang Italian, French and German composers. An outstanding group of virile-voiced American baritones appeared then in the 1920s. The younger members of this group were still active as recently as the late 1970s. Outstanding among its members were the Met-based Verdians, Lawrence Dibert, Richard Bonelli, John Charles Thomas, Robert Weider, Leonard Warren and Robert Merrill. They sang French opera, too, as did the American-born but also Paris-based baritone of the 1920s and 1930s Arthur Entries, also to be found singing Verdi roles at the Met, Covent Garden and the Vienna Opera. During the late 1930s and the 1940s was the big-voiced Hungarian baritone, Sándor Sved. The leading Verdi baritones of the 1970s and 1980s were probably Italy's Renato Brusson and Piero Capocilli, America's Cheryl Milnes, Sweden's Ingvar Wixell and the Romanian baritone Nicolae Hurlia. At the same time, Britain's Sir Thomas Allen was considered to be the most versatile baritone of his generation in regards to repertoire, which ranged from Mozart to Verdi and lighter Wagner roles, through French and Russian opera to modern English music. Another British baritone, Norman Bailey, established himself internationally as a memorable Wotan and Hans Sachs. He had, however, a distinguished if lighter-voiced Wagnerian rival during the 1960s and 1970s in the person of Thomas Stewart of America. Other notable post-war Wagnerian baritones have been Canada's George London, Germany's Hermann UhdE and, more recently, America's James Morris. Among the late 20th century baritones noted throughout the opera world for the Verdi performances was Vladimir Chernov, who emerged from the former USSR to sing at the Met. Chernov followed in the footsteps of such richly endowed East European baritones as Ippolit Prynishnikov, Wakim Tartakov, Oskar Kaminsky, the Václav Brzezinski, George Baklanov, and, during a career lasting from 1935 to 1966, the Bolshois Pavel Lasitsyan, Dmitry Havorostovsky and Sergei Lifakuz are two Russian baritones of the modern era who appear regularly in the West. Like Lasitsyan, they sing Verdi and the works of the native composers, including Tchaikovsky's Eugene Onegin and the Queen of Spades. In the realm of French song, the bass baritone José Van Damme and the lighter-voiced Gerard Souzay have been notable. Sousa's repertoire extended from the Baroque works of Jean-Baptiste Lully to 20th-century composers such as Francis Poulenc. Pierre Benach, Sousa's teacher, was an interpreter of Poulenc's songs in the previous generation. Older baritones identified with this style include Francis Dingilly and Charles Panzera, and Australia's John Brownlee. Another Australian, Peter Dawson, made a small but precious legacy of benchmark Handel recordings during the 1920s and 1930s. Yet another Australian baritone of distinction between the wars was Harold Williams, who was based in the United Kingdom. Important British-born baritones of the 1930s and 1940s were Denis Noble, who sang Italian and English operatic roles, and the Mozartian Roy Henderson. Both appeared often at Covent Garden. Prior to World War II, Germany's Heinrich Schlosser, Gerhard Husch and Herbert Janssen were celebrated for the beautifully sung Lieder recitals as well as for the mellifluous operatic performances in Verdi, Mozart, and Wagner respectively. After the war's conclusion, Hermann Prey and Dietrich Fischer-Dieskau appeared on the scene to take the place. In addition to his interpretations of Lieder and the works of Mozart, Prey sang in Strauss operas and tackled lighter Wagner roles such as Wolfram. Fischer-Dieskau sang parts in fringe operas by the likes of Ferruccio Busoni and Paul Hindemith, as well as appearing in standard works by Verdi and Wagner. He earned his principal renown, however, as a lieder singer. Talented German and Austrian lieder singers of a younger generation include Olaf Bach, Matthias Gern, Wolfgang Holzmer, Thomas Quasthoff, Stefan Jens and Christian Gerher. Well-known non-Germanic baritones of recent times have included the Italians Giorgio Zancanaro and Leo Nucci, the Frenchman François Leroux, the Canadians Gerald Finley and James Westman, and the versatile American Thomas Hampson, his compatriot Nathan Gunn, and the Englishman Simon Keenlyside. Voice type. The vocal range of the baritone lies between the bass and the tenor voice types. The baritone vocal range is usually between the second A below middle C and the A above middle C.